I found a Mother's Day card saying, "Thanks for nothing." The words cut deeper than any knife ever could. That night, they discovered what I had really left in my will. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the L train rattles past my kitchen window every morning at 6:15 sharp. The sound used to wake me with purpose. Now it just reminds me that another day has begun, whether I'm ready or not. The card arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was always my grocery day, the day I'd plan meals for a family that rarely came to eat them anymore. The mailman, Jerry, had been delivering to my building for 15 years. He always smiled, always asked about my arthritis. That morning, he handed me just 2 pieces of mail, a utility bill and a cream-colored envelope with my daughter Rebecca's handwriting. I recognized that handwriting immediately. Slanted letters that curved like question marks, just like when she was 7 years old and wrote me letters saying she loved me, to the moon and back. My heart jumped the way it always did when I saw her name. Maybe she remembered. Maybe, for once, I wouldn't spend Mother's Day alone with my memories and a frozen dinner. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one I'd bought 40 years ago when Robert and I first moved to this neighborhood. The wood was scarred now, marked by decades of homework sessions, birthday cakes, and late-night conversations over coffee. My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope. Age does that to you. Everything becomes a small victory, even opening your own mail. Inside was a card. Plain white, no flowers, no pretty script. Just those 4 words written in black ink: "Thanks for nothing, Mom." The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles went white. The L train rumbled past, but I couldn't hear it over the roaring in my ears. 48 years of motherhood reduced to 4 words. 4 words that felt like a slap across decades of sacrifice, love, and hope. I stared at that card for what felt like hours, though the kitchen clock said only 15 minutes had passed. The same clock that had ticked away countless mornings when I packed lunches, countless evenings when I waited for phone calls that never came, countless nights when I wondered if I had failed somehow as a mother. The worst part wasn't the cruelty. It was the casualness of it. Like it meant nothing to write those words. Like I meant nothing. That night, I walked to my kitchen stove and turned on the gas burner. The blue flame danced, and I held the card above it until the edges caught fire. I watched my daughter's words disappear into ash and smoke. But some wounds don't heal with fire. Some pain burns deeper than any flame. What my children didn't know was that 3 months earlier, I had visited my lawyer, Mrs. Patricia Coleman, on Michigan Avenue. What they didn't know was what they would discover that very night when they found the changes I had made to my will. Changes that would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew about their mother. But let me start from the beginning, because this story didn't begin with a cruel card. It began 50 years ago with love, hope, and dreams that would slowly turn into a nightmare I never saw coming. I was 23 when I married Robert Mitchell in 1974. He worked at the steel plant on the south side, and I was a secretary at a small insurance company downtown. We met at a church dance, and he told me I had the prettiest smile he'd ever seen. We were going to change the world together, or at least our little corner of it on Harper Avenue. Rebecca came first, in 1976. 8 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect baby girl with tiny fists that grabbed my finger like she'd never let go. I quit my job to raise her, just like mothers did back then. Robert's salary was enough, and I wanted to be there for every first word, every first step, every scraped knee and bedtime story. Michael followed in 1978, and then Sarah in 1981. 3 beautiful babies who filled our little house with laughter, chaos, and more love than I knew was possible. I lived for their giggles at breakfast, their tired faces at bedtime, the way they ran to me when thunder scared them at night. Those early years pass in a blur of laundry, grocery shopping, and scraped knees. PTA meetings and dance recitals. Birthday parties in our backyard where I made cakes from scratch because store-bought wasn't good enough for my babies. Robert worked double shifts to support us, and I held down the home front like a general commanding an army of toys and tiny socks. But somewhere in those years, something started to shift. The children grew older, more independent, and I poured myself into their needs like water into sand. It was never enough. Rebecca needed money for cheerleading uniforms. Michael needed help with his car payments. Sarah needed a loan for community college. And I gave, and gave, and gave, because that's what mothers do. Robert died suddenly of a heart attack in 1999. 52 years old, gone before he could see his grandchildren or retire to the fishing cabin he'd always dreamed about. The life insurance wasn't much, but combined with his pension and my secretarial skills, I managed. I got a job at a law office downtown, taking the L train every morning in my sensible shoes and conservative dresses. The children were adults by then, with problems too big for band-aids and bedtime stories. Rebecca's first marriage was falling apart. Michael was struggling with debt from a business that failed. Sarah was a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet. And I was the solution to every crisis, the bank account they could always depend on, the grandmother who never said no. I remember the first time Rebecca asked for money. Really asked, not just hinted or complained about being short. She called me at work, crying because she couldn't make rent after her divorce. $500. I didn't have it, but I put it on my credit card because what choice did I have? She was my daughter. My first baby. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. That 500 became 1,000 the next month. Then 1,500. Then Rebecca's problems became Michael's problems, and Sarah's problems, and suddenly I was working 50 hours a week at 70 years old just to stay afloat while supporting 3 adult children who seemed to think I had unlimited resources. The stock investments Robert had made in the early 90s had grown over the years. Nothing spectacular, but enough to provide some security in my retirement. The IBM and General Electric stocks he'd bought with his overtime pay had turned into a modest nest egg. I watched that money disappear steady as winter snow, transferred to my children's accounts month after month, year after year. But it wasn't just money. It was time, energy, and pieces of my soul I gave away without thinking. I babysat grandchildren while their parents went out, even when my arthritis made it hard to keep up with toddlers. I cooked Thanksgiving dinners for 15 people in my tiny kitchen, then cleaned up alone while everyone watched football in the living room. I listened to hours of complaints about spouses, jobs, and money problems, offering comfort and advice that was rarely taken. Birthdays came and went without acknowledgement. Christmas became an expensive obligation where I gave thoughtful gifts and received generic candles or nothing at all. Mother's Day turned into a quick phone call, if I was lucky, or an obligation dinner at a restaurant where my children spent the whole time on their phones. I started to feel invisible in my own family. A walking wallet with grandma's cooking attached. Useful when needed, forgotten when not. The woman who had given birth to these people, raised them, sacrificed everything for them, had become little more than a resource to be tapped when convenient. The loneliness was crushing. Chicago is a big city, but it can feel impossibly small when you're isolated. I'd ride the L train downtown for work, surrounded by hundreds of people, and feel more alone than I ever had in my life. The other passengers had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. I had a job that barely covered my bills and an empty apartment where I ate dinner alone most nights. My health started to decline. Arthritis made my mornings stiff and painful. My blood pressure medication made me dizzy. I had a small heart episode in 2018 that landed me in the hospital for 3 days. Rebecca visited once, complained about the parking, and left early for a hair appointment. Michael sent flowers with a card that read, "Get well soon, Mom," in the florist's generic handwriting. Sarah called but couldn't come because she was working. I sat in that hospital bed, staring at wilted flowers and listening to monitors beep, wondering when I had become so disposable to the people I loved most. The changes started small. I stopped offering money before being asked. I stopped cooking elaborate family meals unless someone specifically requested them. I stopped calling every day to check in, waiting instead for them to reach out to me. The silence stretched longer and longer between contacts. When they did call, it was always about something they needed. Rebecca needed help with her daughter's private school tuition. Michael was behind on his mortgage. Sarah's car had broken down and she couldn't afford repairs. The conversation was pleasant enough until the real reason emerged, like a snake from tall grass. They'd make small talk for 5 minutes, ask how I was feeling, then launch into their latest crisis. I began to see the pattern clearly. Every call was transactional. Every visit came with a price tag. My children had learned that mother was good for 3 things: money, babysitting, and listening to problems. Everything else about me had become irrelevant. The stock market had been kind to Robert's old investments. Those IBM shares had split twice, and the diversified portfolio his brother had advised us to build had grown steadily over the decades. By 2020, I had accumulated assets worth nearly $200,000. Not wealthy by today's standards, but comfortable enough for a woman living alone in a small apartment. Comfortable enough, I thought, to take care of my children when they needed help. But watching that money disappear month after month, transferred to accounts belonging to children who rarely called just to say hello, began to feel less like generosity and more like being systematically drained. I started keeping careful records. In 2020 alone, I had given Rebecca $8,000. Michael received $6,000. Sarah got $4,000 for various emergencies. $18,000 from a fixed income, while I ate generic cereal for breakfast and skipped meals to make my grocery budget stretch. The real breaking point came in January 2021. I had slipped on ice outside my building and broken my wrist. The cast made everything difficult. I couldn't drive, could barely dress myself, and needed help with basic tasks like opening jars or carrying groceries. I called each of my children. Rebecca was too busy with her job. Michael had his own family to worry about. Sarah couldn't get time off work. Mrs. Ramirez, my 78-year-old neighbor, ended up driving me to doctor appointments and helping with errands. A woman I'd known for only 3 years showed more care than the children I'd raised for decades. That's when I started to understand the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't a mother to these people anymore. I was a convenience. A service provider they could access when needed and ignore when not. The realization felt like drowning in shallow water, devastating and embarrassing at the same time. I spent weeks in that cast thinking about my life, my choices, and what I wanted my remaining years to look like. I was 73 years old. According to actuarial tables, I might have 15 good years left, maybe 20 if I stayed healthy. Did I want to spend them being taken advantage of by my own children? Did I want to die knowing I'd enabled their selfishness instead of teaching them independence and gratitude? The Mother's Day card was just the final insult on a pile of disappointments that had been building for years. But it crystallized something important. My children didn't hate me. They didn't even think about me enough to hate me. I was simply irrelevant to them except as a source of financial support. And that truth hurt worse than any harsh words ever could. The morning after I burned that card, I called Mrs. Coleman's office and made an appointment. Patricia Coleman was an estate planning attorney who'd been recommended by Mrs. Ramirez. She was probably 65, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen plenty of family drama over the years. Her office on Michigan Avenue was small but professional, with law books lining the walls and a picture of her own grandchildren on her desk. I told her everything. The years of financial support, the forgotten birthdays, the hospital stay where I'd been virtually abandoned. I showed her bank statements documenting the thousands of dollars I'd transferred to my children over the years. I explained about the stocks and investments that Robert had left, how they'd grown over time, and how I'd been systematically depleting them to support adult children who seemed to have no limit to their needs or sense of gratitude. Mrs. Coleman listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor," she said finally, "what do you want to happen to your assets when you pass away?" It was a simple question that revealed a complex truth. I'd always assumed everything would go to my children. That's what mothers did, right? We sacrificed during life and provided for our children after death. But Mrs. Coleman's question made me think about what I really wanted, not what was expected. "I want to know they'll be okay," I said. "But I also want to know they learned something from this. I want them to understand that love and money aren't the same thing." Mrs. Coleman smiled. "I think we can arrange that." Over the next several weeks, we crafted a will that reflected both my love for my children and my disappointment in their behavior. The bulk of my estate would indeed go to them, but with conditions that would force them to think about our relationship and their treatment of me. There were also provisions for Mrs. Ramirez, the neighbor who had shown me more kindness in 3 years than my own children had in the past decade. But the most important change was immediate. I opened a new checking account that my children didn't know about. I transferred most of my liquid assets there, leaving only enough in the old account to cover my basic expenses. No more emergency loans. No more financial rescues. My children were going to have to learn what millions of people their age already knew: how to live within their means. The first test came 2 weeks later. Rebecca called, her voice tight with stress. Her daughter needed money for a college trip to Europe. $1,500. In the past, I would have transferred the money that same day, probably adding a little extra so she wouldn't have to worry about spending money. "I'm sorry, honey," I said, my heart pounding with nervousness and determination. "I can't help with that right now." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "What do you mean you can't help?" "I mean I don't have extra money to give right now." "But Mom, this is important. It's educational. Sophie will be the only kid who can't afford to go." The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Sophie was my granddaughter. I loved her. I wanted her to have experiences and opportunities. But I also wanted her to learn that money doesn't grow on trees and that grandma wasn't an endless ATM. "Then perhaps you and Sophie can find other ways to raise the money," I said gently. "A part-time job, fundraising, maybe asking her father to contribute." Rebecca's tone turned cold. "I can't believe you're being so selfish. After everything we've been through this year." Selfish. The word hit me like a slap. 43 years of putting my children's needs before my own, and now I was selfish for saying no to one request. The old Eleanor would have apologized, found the money somehow, and suffered in silence. The new Eleanor took a deep breath and held her ground. "I love you and Sophie very much," I said. "But my answer is no." Rebecca hung up without saying goodbye. I sat holding the phone, my hands shaking, wondering if I'd just destroyed my relationship with my daughter and granddaughter over $1,500. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about the money. It was about respect, boundaries, and teaching my children that I was more than just a financial resource. Michael called 3 days later. His tone was different, more calculated. He started with concern about my health, asked about my arthritis, even mentioned that he'd been thinking about that time we went fishing when he was 12. I knew what was coming before he got to it. His air conditioning had died in the middle of July. The repair would cost $1,200, and they didn't have it. Could I help them out? Just until his next paycheck. He'd pay me back, of course. No, sweetie, I said, using the same gentle tone I'd used when he was small and asking for something he couldn't have. I can't help with that. The calculated warmth disappeared immediately. What's wrong with you lately? First Rebecca said you wouldn't help with Sophie's trip, now this. Are you having money problems? Because if you are, we can figure something out. The irony was breathtaking. My children were offering to help me with money problems caused by helping them with their money problems. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the cycle I'd enabled for so many years. I'm not having money problems, I said. I'm having boundary problems. And I'm fixing them. Michael's voice turned sharp. Boundary problems? With your own children? Mom, we're not strangers asking for handouts. We're your kids. This is what family does. Yes, I said quietly. Family supports each other. But support doesn't just mean money, and it doesn't flow in only one direction. The conversation ended badly, with Michael saying things I won't repeat here. Harsh words about ingratitude and selfishness, accusations that I was punishing them for crimes they didn't understand. When he hung up, I cried for an hour. Not because of his words, but because of how clearly they revealed what I'd become to my children. Sarah's call came the following week. She was smarter than her siblings, more manipulative. She started with a story about taking her kids to the park, how they'd asked about Grandma Eleanor, how much they missed me. She told me about little Emma's first loose tooth and how Jake had made the honor roll at school. Then came the setup. Her hours had been cut at work. She was 3 months behind on rent. The landlord was threatening eviction. She had nowhere else to turn. Could I please help her family stay in their home? The old fear rose up in me like floodwater. My grandchildren on the street because their grandmother was too selfish to help. Sarah crying, the children confused and scared. How could I live with myself if I said no to this? But I'd learned something in the weeks since I started setting boundaries. I'd learned that my children were incredibly resourceful when they couldn't depend on Mom's money. Rebecca had found another way to fund Sophie's trip. Michael had managed to get his air conditioning fixed without going into debt. Somehow, miraculously, they'd survived without my financial intervention. Sarah, honey, I said carefully, I can't give you money for rent. But I can help in other ways. I can watch the kids while you look for additional work. I can help you contact social services about assistance programs. I can make calls to charities that help families avoid eviction. I don't need charity, Sarah snapped. I need my mother to act like a mother. There it was again. The assumption that being a mother meant being an ATM. That love was measured in dollars transferred, problems solved with money rather than time, attention, and emotional support. I am acting like a mother, I said quietly. I'm trying to help you become independent and strong. Giving you money every time you have a crisis isn't helping you. It's enabling you. Sarah used words that no daughter should ever use with her mother. Words that revealed how she really saw me, what she really thought of the woman who had raised her, sacrificed for her, and loved her unconditionally for 32 years. When she hung up, I knew I'd lost something precious and irreplaceable. But I also knew I'd gained something equally important, my self-respect. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life. My children stopped calling except for obligatory holiday check-ins that felt forced and cold. There were no visits, no grandchildren running through my apartment, no family dinners or birthday celebrations. The silence was deafening. But something unexpected happened in that silence. I started to remember who I was before I became defined by my children's needs. I started reading again, books I'd put aside years ago because there was always someone who needed something. I started taking walks along the lakefront, watching the sunrise over Lake Michigan without checking my phone every 5 minutes for crisis calls from my children. Mrs. Ramirez and I became closer friends. She taught me to make authentic Mexican food, and I taught her to knit. We started having coffee together every Tuesday morning, sharing stories about our lives, our children, and our dreams. She told me about growing up in Mexico, how she'd come to Chicago as a young bride and built a life from nothing. I told her about my marriage to Robert, about raising 3 children as a stay-at-home mother, about the slow erosion of respect that had brought me to this point. Mija, she said one morning, using the Spanish term of endearment that always warmed my heart, you did what you thought was right. But children who take and take without giving back, they aren't loving their mother. They're using her. It was a hard truth, but it was truth nonetheless. My children had learned that they could treat me poorly, ignore me, take my money, and face no consequences. I had taught them this by accepting it for so long. The only way to change the dynamic was to change my own behavior. I started volunteering at a local food bank on Saturdays. The work was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected. I was helping people who genuinely needed assistance, and they were grateful in a way my own children had never been. The other volunteers became friends. We were mostly older women, some widowed, some divorced, all finding purpose in service that went beyond our own families. My financial situation improved dramatically without the constant drain of supporting 3 adult children. The stocks in my portfolio began to recover value I could actually keep. I paid off my credit cards for the first time in 5 years. I even started putting money aside for things I wanted to do, maybe a trip to see fall colors in New England, or a cruise to Alaska that I'd dreamed about for years. But the real change was internal. I stopped checking my phone constantly, hoping for contact from my children. I stopped measuring my worth by their approval or disapproval. I started making decisions based on what I wanted, what made me happy, what aligned with my values. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. The holidays were hard. Thanksgiving came and went without invitations or visits. Christmas was a quiet affair with Mrs. Ramirez and a few friends from the food bank. But even in the sadness, there was peace. No stress about cooking for ungrateful people, no financial pressure to buy expensive gifts for people who barely acknowledged them, no walking on eggshells to avoid family drama. Spring arrived early in 2022. I was sitting in my kitchen on a bright April morning, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee, when the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a cream-colored envelope with Rebecca's handwriting. My heart jumped, just like it always did when I saw evidence that one of my children was thinking about me. Mother's Day was still 2 weeks away, but perhaps Rebecca was reaching out early. Perhaps the months of silence had given her time to think about our relationship, to miss me, to realize that our problems could be solved with conversation and mutual respect rather than ultimatums and harsh words. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a plain white card with no decoration, no flowers, no sentimental message. Just 4 words written in black ink: "Thanks for nothing, Mom." The cruelty was breathtaking. After everything we'd been through, after all the boundaries I'd tried to set, after all the love I'd poured into raising her, this was her Mother's Day message. Thanks for nothing. I sat staring at that card for a long time, feeling emotions I couldn't quite name. Hurt, certainly. Anger, definitely. But also something else: clarity. This card wasn't really about me or my failings as a mother. It was about Rebecca's inability to see me as anything more than a resource she could no longer access. It was about a grown woman throwing a tantrum because her personal ATM had been shut down. That evening, I walked to my kitchen stove and turned on the gas burner. I held the card above the flame until it caught fire, watching the hateful words disappear into smoke and ash. As I watched it burn, I thought about all the love I'd given, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the years I'd spent putting my children's needs before my own well-being. I thought about Robert, too, and what he would say about this situation. He'd been a good father, firm but fair, loving but not indulgent. He would have been appalled by our children's behavior, but he also would have understood my need to protect myself from emotional and financial abuse. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Mrs. Coleman and asked for another appointment. It was time to make some final adjustments to my will, adjustments that would send a message my children would never forget. The next morning, I drove to Mrs. Coleman's office on Michigan Avenue. Chicago was beautiful in late spring, the trees green and full, flowers blooming in planters along the sidewalks. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if burning that card had also burned away the guilt and obligation that had weighed me down for so long. Mrs. Coleman welcomed me into her office with her usual warmth. She could see something had changed in me, and she waited patiently while I explained about the Mother's Day card and my decision to modify my will one final time. "I want them to understand," I said, "that actions have consequences. That you can't treat people poorly and expect to be rewarded for it. But I also want them to know that I never stopped loving them." Mrs. Coleman smiled. "I think we can accomplish both of those goals." The changes we made were significant but fair. Each of my children would still inherit a substantial portion of my estate, but only after certain conditions were met. They would have to attend family counseling sessions to address our relationship issues. They would have to write letters of apology acknowledging how their behavior had hurt me. And they would have to commit to regular contact and involvement in my life for at least 1 year before receiving their inheritances. Additionally, a significant portion of my estate would go to Mrs. Ramirez, who had shown me more kindness and consideration in 3 years than my children had in the past decade. Another portion would go to the food bank where I'd been volunteering, ensuring that my money would continue helping people who genuinely appreciated assistance. But the most important change was the letter I wrote to be read aloud when my will was executed. In it, I explained my decisions, my disappointments, and my hopes for the future. I talked about the difference between loving someone and enabling them. I talked about respect, gratitude, and the importance of family relationships that flow in both directions. The letter took me weeks to write. I wanted it to be honest but not cruel, firm but not vindictive. I wanted my children to understand that every decision in my will was made out of love, even the painful ones. Most importantly, I wanted them to know that it wasn't too late to change our relationship if they were willing to do the work. With the will finalized and signed, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced in years. I had taken control of my life and my legacy. My children would learn about consequences and accountability, whether they wanted to or not. And perhaps, if I was very lucky, they would learn to see me as more than just a source of financial support. The summer passed quietly and peacefully. I took the trip to New England I'd been dreaming about, staying in small bed and breakfasts and watching the countryside roll past train windows. I visited museums, ate at nice restaurants, and bought myself souvenirs without calculating whether I could afford them. For the first time in decades, I was spending money on myself without guilt. Mrs. Ramirez and I started a small garden in the courtyard behind our apartment building. We grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, sharing the harvest with other neighbors who appreciated fresh vegetables. The physical work was good for my arthritis, and the sense of community was healing for my soul. I also started writing letters to my grandchildren. Not asking for visits or trying to manipulate their parents, just sharing stories about their grandfather Robert, about their parents when they were young, about our family history and traditions. I didn't know if their parents would let them read the letters, but I felt compelled to leave some bridge between my grandchildren and me, some way for them to know their grandmother beyond whatever stories they might hear. Fall came early that year, and with it came the first real test of my resolve. Sarah called in October, her voice softer than it had been in months. She started with apologies, saying she'd been thinking about our fights, admitting that maybe she'd been too harsh. She asked about my health, mentioned that the kids missed me. My heart wanted to believe her, but my head remembered the pattern. Apologies followed by requests. Warmth followed by financial asks. Love offered as currency to buy assistance. Sure enough, after 15 minutes of pleasant conversation, the real reason for her call emerged. She'd been laid off from one of her jobs. Money was tight again. The kids needed winter coats, and she couldn't afford them. Could I help? Just this once? She'd learned her lesson about managing money better. The old Eleanor would have said yes immediately, probably offering to buy more than just coats. The new Eleanor took a deep breath and prepared to hold her boundaries one more time. Sarah, I love you and I love my grandchildren, I said carefully. But I can't give you money for coats or anything else. However, I can take the kids shopping for coats myself, if you'd like. I can spend time with them and make sure they have what they need for winter. The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. Sarah didn't want me to be involved with her children. She wanted my money, transferred anonymously to her account so she could be the hero who provided for her kids. She wanted the financial support without the relationship, the assistance without accountability. Never mind, she said coldly. I'll figure something out. The offer stands, I replied. I'd love to spend time with Emma and Jake. I'd love to take them shopping and maybe get lunch afterward. But Sarah had already hung up, and I knew she wouldn't call back. My grandchildren would get their winter coats somehow, probably from their father or from a credit card Sarah couldn't afford. And I would remain the grandmother they rarely saw, the woman who had chosen selfishness over enabling. The holidays approached again, and again I waited for invitations that didn't come. Christmas was another quiet affair with Mrs. Ramirez and my friends from the food bank. We exchanged small gifts and shared stories about our lives, creating the kind of warmth and connection I'd been looking for in my own family. But this Christmas was different because I wasn't sad about spending it away from my children. I was grateful for the people who actually wanted my company, who valued my conversation, who saw me as more than an ATM with holiday cooking skills attached. I was learning that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love and respect you just as you are. The new year brought unexpected news. Rebecca called in February, her voice strained and formal. She was getting divorced again, this time from husband number 3. She needed a place to stay while she figured out her living situation. Could she move in with me temporarily? Just for a month or two? This request was different from the others because it wasn't directly about money. It was about shelter, about family supporting family during a difficult time. It was the kind of help I would have provided without question in the past. But I'd learned to look deeper, to ask questions, to protect myself from being used even by people I loved. What happened, honey? I asked gently. The story that emerged was familiar and heartbreaking. Another marriage built more on financial convenience than love. Another husband who promised stability but delivered chaos. Another relationship ending in bitter recriminations and legal complications. But as Rebecca talked, I began to understand that this wasn't just bad luck or poor judgment. This was a pattern of expecting other people to solve her problems, to provide stability she'd never learned to create for herself. 3 marriages, all to men who were supposed to take care of her financially. 3 divorces when those men proved unreliable or unwilling to support her lifestyle. I need somewhere safe to land, she said finally. Just temporarily. I won't be any trouble. I loved my daughter. I wanted to help her. But I also knew that temporary had a way of becoming permanent, especially when someone had no incentive to become independent. I thought about my small apartment, my carefully crafted peace, my boundaries that had taken so much courage to establish. Rebecca, I love you and I want to help, I said slowly. But I don't think living together is the right solution for either of us. Instead, I can help you research affordable apartments. I can give you references for jobs. I can provide emotional support while you rebuild your life. The explosion was immediate and volcanic. How could I turn away my own daughter in her time of need? What kind of mother chooses her own comfort over her child's welfare? Rebecca accused me of being selfish, cruel, and narcissistic. She said things designed to hurt, words that revealed how little respect she had for me or my feelings. When she finally stopped shouting, I waited for the silence to settle before responding. I understand you're hurt and scared, I said quietly. But screaming at me and calling me names isn't going to change my mind. I've offered to help in ways that don't compromise my own well-being. If that's not enough for you, I'm sorry. Rebecca hung up with a string of profanity that would have made Robert roll over in his grave. But I felt oddly calm afterward, as if I'd passed some important test. I had offered reasonable help and been rejected because it wasn't the kind of help Rebecca wanted. She wanted me to sacrifice my peace and independence for her convenience, and I had finally learned to say no. Spring returned to Chicago, and with it came another Mother's Day. I didn't expect cards or calls from my children, and I wasn't disappointed. Mrs. Ramirez and I went to brunch at a little cafe near Millennium Park, then walked along the lakefront enjoying the sunshine and the boats on the water. It was a good day, peaceful and pleasant, filled with genuine affection from a friend who valued my company. We talked about everything and nothing, her grandchildren in Mexico, my adventures in volunteering, the flowers we wanted to plant this summer. It was the kind of Mother's Day I'd dreamed of for years, celebrating the relationships that actually brought joy to my life. That evening, I called Mrs. Coleman to discuss one final addition to my will. I wanted to establish a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education, something that would help other women become independent and self-sufficient. It seemed like a fitting way to honor both my struggles and my hopes for the future. The scholarship would be modest but meaningful, providing assistance to women who were working to better their lives rather than depending on others to solve their problems. It would be my way of turning years of enabling into years of empowerment, helping people who were committed to helping themselves. Mrs. Coleman was enthusiastic about the idea, and we began the process of setting up the scholarship immediately. It would be one more way my estate would serve people who truly needed and appreciated help, rather than simply rewarding bad behavior with inherited wealth. As summer approached, I received an unexpected visitor. Sophie, my granddaughter, appeared at my door one Saturday afternoon. She was 17 now, tall and beautiful, with Rebecca's eyes and Robert's stubborn chin. I hadn't seen her in over a year, but she looked so much like her mother at that age that my heart almost stopped. "Hi, Grandma," she said shyly. "I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to talk to you." I invited her in, made tea, and listened while Sophie struggled to find words for what she wanted to say. She talked about the tension between her mother and me, about feeling caught in the middle, about missing the grandmother who used to be such a big part of her life. "Mom says you've changed," Sophie said carefully. "She says you don't want to help family anymore." I chose my words very carefully, not wanting to criticize Rebecca but also wanting Sophie to understand the truth. "I'll always want to help family," I said. "But I've learned there's a difference between helping someone and enabling them. True help teaches people to solve their own problems. Enabling just creates dependence." Sophie was quiet for a long time, processing this idea. Finally, she said, "Is that why you said no to my Europe trip? To teach Mom a lesson?" "No, sweetheart. I said no because I needed to teach myself a lesson. I needed to learn that saying no doesn't make me a bad grandmother. It makes me a grandmother who expects respect and appreciation instead of just taking whatever treatment I'm given." We talked for 2 hours, and I could see Sophie beginning to understand the complexity of adult relationships in ways she'd never had to consider before. She was smart and thoughtful, more mature than her mother had been at the same age. I found myself hoping that Sophie would learn from my mistakes and her mother's, that she would build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. As she prepared to leave, Sophie hugged me tighter than she had since she was small. "I love you, Grandma," she said. "And I'm sorry things got so complicated." "I love you too, baby girl," I replied. "And it's not your fault things got complicated. Sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect relationships we care about." After Sophie left, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about the cycles we pass down to our children, often without realizing it. Rebecca had learned from me that love meant financial sacrifice, that mothers provided unlimited support without expecting anything in return. Now Sophie was watching her mother struggle with independence, watching me enforce boundaries, trying to figure out what healthy relationships should look like. Perhaps the most important thing I could give my granddaughter wasn't money or material support, but an example of a woman who finally learned to respect herself enough to demand respect from others. Maybe that lesson would serve her better in the long run than any Europe trip or college fund ever could. The months passed peacefully. I continued volunteering at the food bank, tending my garden with Mrs. Ramirez, and enjoying my independence. I took another trip, this time to Alaska, fulfilling a dream I'd harbored since Robert first mentioned wanting to see glaciers and whales. The cruise was wonderful, filled with new experiences and friendly people who appreciated good conversation and shared adventures. I started taking art classes at the community center, something I'd wanted to do for decades but never had time for when I was constantly managing my children's crises. My paintings weren't very good, but the process of creating something beautiful brought me joy I hadn't experienced since I was young. My health improved as my stress levels decreased. Without the constant worry about my children's problems, without the financial pressure of supporting multiple adult dependents, I found myself sleeping better and feeling more energetic. My doctor remarked on the improvement in my blood pressure and overall vitality. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I saw myself. For years, I had defined my worth by how much I could give, how many problems I could solve, how indispensable I could make myself to my children. Now I was learning that my value as a person wasn't tied to my usefulness to others. I was worthy of love and respect simply because I existed, not because of what I could provide. This shift in perspective changed everything about how I interacted with the world. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped minimizing my own needs, stopped accepting poor treatment from people who should have cherished me. I began to understand what self-respect actually looked like, and it was both terrifying and liberating. Fall arrived again, bringing with it the first anniversary of Rebecca's cruel Mother's Day card. I thought about that card often, not with anger anymore, but with something approaching gratitude. Those 4 words, "thanks for nothing," had finally shown me the truth I'd been avoiding for years. My children did think I'd given them nothing of value, because they'd never learned to value anything that couldn't be deposited in a bank account. But I knew better now. I had given them everything that mattered: life, love, guidance, support, and countless opportunities to become good people. If they couldn't see the value in those gifts, the problem wasn't with my giving. The problem was with their inability to receive, appreciate, and reciprocate love in healthy ways. That understanding freed me from guilt I'd carried for decades. I stopped wondering if I'd been a bad mother, stopped questioning every decision I'd made while raising my children. I had done my best with the knowledge and resources I had at the time. Their inability to treat me with basic kindness and respect wasn't a reflection of my failures as a parent. It was a reflection of their failures as adult human beings. The holiday season approached again, and this time I was proactive about creating the kind of Christmas I actually wanted. I invited Mrs. Ramirez and 3 friends from the food bank to Christmas dinner in my apartment. We cooked together, shared stories, exchanged small gifts, and created the kind of warm, loving celebration I'd been longing for. There were no arguments about money, no stress about people who didn't appreciate the effort, no walking on eggshells to avoid family drama. Just good food, good friends, and genuine affection shared freely among people who had chosen to be part of each other's lives. As we sat around my small table, laughing over dessert and coffee, I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or guilt or financial transactions, but mutual care and respect freely given and gratefully received. The new year brought another call from Michael, this time with a different tone. He was asking about my health, wondering if we could talk, suggesting that maybe it was time to work things out between us. I was cautiously hopeful until he revealed that Rebecca had told him about changes to my will. Suddenly his motivation for reconciliation became much clearer. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Michael admitted that he'd only called because he was worried about his inheritance. He tried to justify his behavior, claiming that children shouldn't have to earn their parents' love through good behavior. He accused me of manipulation, of holding my will over their heads to force them to treat me better. "You're right," I said calmly. "Children shouldn't have to earn their parents' love. But adult children should treat their parents with basic respect and kindness if they want to maintain relationships with them. Love flows freely. Respect is earned and maintained through consistent behavior." Michael couldn't understand the distinction. In his mind, my love and my money were the same thing. Therefore, limiting access to my money meant limiting my love. The idea that I could love him deeply while still protecting myself from his financial exploitation was beyond his comprehension. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected for months. My children were incapable of seeing me as anything other than a resource to be managed. Even their attempts at reconciliation were transactional, motivated by fear of financial loss rather than genuine desire for relationship. I felt sad for them, truly sad. They had reduced one of the most important relationships in their lives to a business arrangement. They had exchanged unconditional parental love for conditional financial support, and they didn't even realize what they'd lost in the bargain. Spring returned once more, and with it came my 75th birthday. I celebrated with a small party in Mrs. Ramirez's apartment, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared about me. We had cake, played cards, and shared stories about our lives and dreams for the future. It was the best birthday I'd had in years, filled with laughter and affection from people who valued my company for its own sake. No one asked for money or favors. No one treated me like an obligation or a necessary evil. Just friends celebrating another year of friendship and the blessing of still being here to enjoy each other's company. That night, as I sat in my quiet apartment reflecting on the day, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. The pain of my children's rejection had been terrible, but it had also been necessary. It had forced me to find my own worth, to build relationships based on mutual respect, to create a life that brought me joy rather than constantly draining my energy and resources. I thought about Robert often, wondering what he would think of how our family had evolved. I believed he would be proud of me for finally standing up for myself, for refusing to be used and discarded by our own children. He had always been better at setting boundaries than I was, and I wished I'd learned that skill earlier in life. But regrets were pointless now. I was 75 years old, in reasonably good health, and finally living life on my own terms. I had enough money to be comfortable without constantly worrying about supporting ungrateful adult children. I had friends who appreciated me. I had hobbies that brought me joy. I had peace. Most importantly, I had self-respect. After decades of measuring my worth by how much I could give to people who gave nothing back, I had finally learned to value myself. That lesson had come at a high price, but it was worth every moment of loneliness and every tear I'd shed. Summer brought another unexpected visitor. Sarah arrived at my door on a hot July afternoon, looking older and more tired than I remembered. She asked if we could talk, and something in her tone made me invite her in despite my reservations. What followed was the most honest conversation I'd had with any of my children in years. Sarah talked about her struggles as a single mother, about the pressure she felt to provide for her children, about how she'd come to see me as a solution to problems rather than a person with feelings and needs of my own. "I know I hurt you," she said quietly. "I know I took advantage of your love and generosity. I didn't understand then that asking for money all the time was hurting our relationship. I just saw you as mom, and moms are supposed to help their kids no matter what." I listened carefully, looking for signs that this was another manipulation designed to restore access to my financial support. But Sarah's tears seemed genuine, and her acknowledgement of wrongdoing was more complete than anything I'd heard from Rebecca or Michael. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," she continued. "And I'm not asking for money. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I understand now why you had to protect yourself from us." We talked for 3 hours, really talked, for the first time since she was a teenager. Sarah told me about her job, her children, her hopes for the future. I shared stories about my volunteering, my art classes, my friendships. It felt like getting to know each other as adults rather than playing the tired roles of demanding child and depleted parent. When Sarah left, she hugged me carefully, like she was afraid I might disappear. "I love you, Mom," she said. "And I'm going to work on being a better daughter. Not to get money or anything like that. Just because you deserve better from me." I watched her drive away with mixed feelings. Part of me was hopeful that we might rebuild our relationship on healthier foundations. Part of me was skeptical, wondering if this was just a more sophisticated form of manipulation. Time would tell which Sarah was real, the one who had used me for years, or the one who seemed genuinely remorseful about that treatment. Fall arrived early that year, and with it came a phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Coleman called to tell me that someone had been asking questions about my will, trying to determine whether it could be contested after my death. The inquiries were being made by a lawyer representing Rebecca. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. Even the prospect of losing their inheritances hadn't motivated my children to examine their own behavior. Instead of working to repair our relationship, Rebecca was working to circumvent the consequences of her choices. She was still trying to get my money without offering me basic respect or kindness in return. Mrs. Coleman assured me that my will was legally sound and couldn't be easily contested, but the knowledge that Rebecca was already planning legal action against my estate was heartbreaking. She was so focused on what she felt entitled to receive that she couldn't see what she was actively destroying. That phone call clarified something important for me. I had been harboring hope that my children might eventually understand what they'd lost when they reduced our relationship to financial transactions. But Rebecca's attempt to contest my will proved that she still saw me only as an obstacle to accessing what she considered her rightful inheritance. The sadness was profound, but so was the resolve it created. I called Mrs. Coleman and scheduled another appointment to make final adjustments to my estate plan. If my children were determined to treat my death as a financial opportunity, I was determined to ensure that my final message to them would be crystal clear. The additional changes were significant. I reduced their inheritances further and increased the donations to charity, particularly the scholarship fund for single mothers and the food bank where I'd found such purpose and community. I also added provisions that would make contesting the will extremely expensive and likely to fail, protecting my wishes from legal challenges motivated by greed. Most importantly, I rewrote the letter that would be read when my will was executed. The new version was more direct about my disappointments, more specific about their failures as adult children, and more explicit about the reasons behind my decisions. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about why they were receiving less than they expected. But I also made sure to include expressions of love and hope for their futures. These were my children, despite everything, and I wanted my final words to them to acknowledge both my disappointment in their behavior and my enduring desire for their happiness and growth. The letter took weeks to perfect. I wanted it to be a document they would remember for the rest of their lives, something that might eventually inspire them to become better people. I wrote draft after draft, balancing honesty with compassion, accountability with forgiveness. Winter came early and harsh that year, but I was prepared for it in ways I'd never been before. My apartment was warm and cozy, my pantry was well stocked, and my spirit was peaceful. I spent quiet evenings reading, painting, and corresponding with friends. The loneliness that had once felt crushing now felt like solitude, chosen and treasured. Mrs. Ramirez's health began to decline that winter, and I found myself in the unfamiliar role of primary caregiver. It was a responsibility I took on gladly, grateful for the opportunity to repay some of the kindness she'd shown me. We spent hours together, talking about life and death, family and friendship, regret and acceptance. Taking care of Mrs. Ramirez reminded me of all the good parts of being needed by someone you love. The difference was that she was grateful for my help, never took it for granted, and gave back as much as her condition allowed. Even when she could barely get out of bed, she listened to my concerns, offered advice, and made me laugh with stories from her long life. This was what loving service looked like when it was appreciated and reciprocated. This was how families should function, with care flowing naturally in all directions rather than being demanded and taken without acknowledgement or gratitude. As spring approached, I realized I was facing what might be my last Mother's Day with any hope of reconciliation with my children. I was 76 now, increasingly aware of my own mortality, and tired of carrying the weight of broken relationships. Part of me wanted to reach out one final time, to offer an opportunity for healing before it was too late. But I also knew that any contact from me would likely be seen as weakness, an opening for renewed financial exploitation. My children had made their choices clear through years of behavior. They wanted access to my resources without offering respect or genuine relationship in return. Nothing I'd seen in recent months suggested that fundamental dynamic had changed. Instead of reaching out to my children, I wrote letters to my grandchildren. Long, loving letters sharing family history, expressing hopes for their futures, and explaining in age-appropriate ways why I'd had to limit contact with their parents. I wanted them to know they were loved, even if our relationship had been casualties of the bigger conflict. The letters were some of the most important writing I'd ever done. I told stories about their grandfather Robert, about their parents as children, about family traditions and values I hoped they might carry forward even if I wouldn't be there to share them. I tried to give them pieces of their heritage that might otherwise be lost to family discord. Mother's Day arrived quietly that year. I spent it gardening with Mrs. Ramirez, who was feeling well enough to sit in the sunshine and direct my planting efforts. We put in tomatoes and peppers, herbs and flowers, creating beauty we might or might not live to see fully mature. There was something hopeful about planting seeds anyway, trusting in growth we couldn't guarantee. That evening, as I watered our new plants and watched the sunset paint my windows gold, I felt at peace with my choices. I had loved my children unconditionally for decades, but I had finally learned that unconditional love didn't require accepting unconditional disrespect. I could love them from a distance while protecting myself from their harmful behavior. The summer that followed was perhaps the most content time of my adult life. Free from the constant stress of managing my children's crises, I discovered reserves of energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I took longer walks, planned more ambitious garden projects, and even considered adopting a small dog for companionship. My art improved significantly as I dedicated more time to practice and took advanced classes at the community center. I wasn't going to become a famous painter at 76, but I was creating beauty that brought me joy and satisfaction. The process of learning something completely new felt like proof that life could still hold surprises and growth. I also deepened my involvement with the food bank, eventually joining their board of directors. Using skills from my decades of managing a household and navigating bureaucracy, I helped them secure grants and improve their distribution systems. It was meaningful work that connected me to my community in ways I'd never experienced while isolated in family dysfunction. Fall brought news that shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did. Sophie called to tell me that Rebecca was engaged again, this time to a man she'd known for only 6 months. The wedding was planned for December, and Rebecca was hoping I would contribute financially to the celebration. The request came through Sophie, which felt particularly manipulative. My granddaughter was clearly uncomfortable delivering the message, caught once again between her mother's financial needs and her grandmother's boundaries. I felt sorry for Sophie, but I also admired how carefully she presented the request, making it clear these weren't her words or her expectations. "Tell your mother I wish her happiness in her marriage," I said gently. "But I won't be contributing money to the wedding. If she'd like me to attend as a guest, she can invite me directly and we can discuss what kind of relationship we might be able to have going forward." Sophie nodded, looking relieved that I hadn't asked her to deliver a harsh message back to her mother. We talked for a while longer, and I could see that my granddaughter was beginning to understand the impossible position Rebecca had put her in by using her as an intermediary for financial requests. The wedding invitation never came, which told me everything I needed to know about Rebecca's priorities. She wanted my money but not my presence, my financial support but not my actual involvement in her life. It was the final confirmation that our relationship had been completely transactional for years. Winter settled over Chicago like a familiar blanket, and I prepared for what I sensed might be my last holiday season. Not because I was particularly ill, but because I was increasingly aware of time's passage and my own mortality. I wanted to spend Christmas surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, creating memories that would warm my heart regardless of how many more holidays I might have. Mrs. Ramirez's condition had worsened, and she wouldn't be able to host or attend gatherings. Instead, I organized a small celebration in her apartment, inviting our closest friends and preparing simple foods we could all enjoy together. It was intimate and meaningful, filled with the kind of love and gratitude that had been missing from family celebrations for so many years. As we sat around Mrs. Ramirez's small table, sharing stories and holding hands for a blessing she offered in Spanish and English, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. Yes, I had lost my relationship with my children. But I had gained something equally precious, a sense of my own worth and the ability to create chosen family with people who valued what I had to offer. The new year arrived quietly, and with it came an unexpected peace about my legacy. For so many years, I had worried about what I would leave behind, how my children would remember me, whether I had been a good enough mother. Now I understood that legacy isn't just what you leave to people. It's also what you refuse to enable, the boundaries you model, the self-respect you demonstrate even when it's difficult. My children might never understand the gift I had tried to give them by refusing to continue enabling their irresponsible behavior. But perhaps my grandchildren would see it eventually. Perhaps Sophie and her cousins would remember their grandmother as a woman who finally learned to stand up for herself, who chose dignity over convenience, who demonstrated that love and boundaries could coexist. Spring brought the most beautiful garden Mrs. Ramirez and I had ever created. Despite her failing health, she directed my efforts with the skill of someone who had coaxed life from soil for 8 decades. We planted flowers that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season, creating continuous beauty for the other residents of our building. As I worked in the soil, following Mrs. Ramirez's gentle instructions, I thought about the metaphor of gardening. Some plants thrive with minimal care, while others require constant attention and still fail to flourish. Some respond well to pruning, growing stronger when cut back. Others wither if not handled with extreme gentleness. My relationship with my children had been like tending plants that demanded constant feeding but produced no flowers, required endless attention but offered no beauty in return. I had fertilized dysfunction for decades, wondering why my garden produced only weeds and disappointment. Now, at 77, I was finally learning to tend relationships that could actually grow. Mrs. Ramirez, despite her physical limitations, gave back warmth, wisdom, and appreciation. My friends from the food bank offered companionship, support, and shared purpose. These relationships flourished because they were tended by people who understood that gardens require mutual care. The summer passed peacefully, marked by small joys and quiet accomplishments. I completed a painting I was particularly proud of, a view of Lake Michigan at sunset, painted from memory of one of my walks along the lakefront. The colors were vibrant and alive, capturing not just the visual beauty of the scene but the emotional peace I had found in those solitary moments by the water. I gave the painting to Mrs. Ramirez, who wept when she saw it. "Mija," she said, using the endearment that always warmed my heart, "you have captured the light. This is how you see the world now, full of light even in the shadows." Her words stayed with me for weeks. I had indeed learned to see light in places where I once saw only darkness. The quiet of my apartment was no longer loneliness but solitude. The absence of my children's demands was no longer abandonment but freedom. The small circle of genuine relationships was no longer isolation but intimacy. As fall approached, bringing with it the anniversary of my decision to burn Rebecca's cruel Mother's Day card, I reflected on everything that had changed in the year since that moment of clarity. I had lost relationships that had defined my identity for decades, but I had gained something more valuable, myself. The woman who had once measured her worth by how much she could give to ungrateful recipients had become a woman who recognized her own value. The mother who had enabled destructive behavior in the name of love had become a person who understood that true love sometimes requires difficult boundaries. The victim of emotional and financial exploitation had become a survivor who refused to accept poor treatment from anyone. That transformation hadn't been easy or painless. There had been nights when I questioned every decision, days when the loneliness felt unbearable, moments when I nearly picked up the phone to restore the old, dysfunctional patterns just to hear my children's voices again. But I had persevered, supported by friends who helped me remember why I had needed to make changes in the first place. Mrs. Ramirez, in particular, had been a constant source of wisdom and encouragement, reminding me that self-respect was not selfish but necessary, that boundaries were not walls but bridges to healthier relationships. October brought the kind of crisp, golden weather that makes Chicago beautiful. I spent long afternoons walking through neighborhoods I'd lived in for decades, seeing them with new eyes now that I was no longer consumed by family drama and financial stress. The city felt friendlier, more welcoming, full of possibilities I hadn't noticed when I was focused only on my children's problems. During one of those walks, I encountered Sophie near her high school. She was 18 now, preparing for college, looking more mature and confident than I remembered. We talked for nearly an hour, standing on a street corner in the afternoon sunshine, catching up on her life and dreams. Sophie was planning to study social work, inspired partly by watching family dysfunction and partly by her own desire to help people build healthier relationships. She talked about her mother's latest marriage troubles, her Uncle Michael's continued financial struggles, and her own determination to break the cycles she'd observed. "I've been thinking about what you said about enabling versus helping," she told me. "I can see now how giving people money all the time doesn't actually solve their problems. It just makes them dependent and kind of angry that they're dependent." Her insight filled me with hope. If Sophie could learn these lessons at 18 instead of 77, she might avoid decades of the pain I had experienced. She might build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. She might understand her own worth early enough to protect it. As we prepared to part, Sophie hugged me tightly. "I love you, Grandma. And I understand why you had to make the choices you made. I hope someday Mom will understand too." "I hope so, sweetheart," I replied. "But even if she doesn't, you can learn from all of this. You can build the kind of relationships you deserve, with people who appreciate what you have to offer." Walking home from that encounter, I felt lighter than I had in months. My efforts to model self-respect and healthy boundaries hadn't been wasted after all. Sophie had been watching, learning, preparing to make different choices in her own life. Perhaps that was legacy enough. November brought difficult news. Mrs. Ramirez's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she needed more care than I could provide alone. Her family in Mexico wanted her to move to be near them, but she was torn between practical necessity and her desire to finish her days in the neighborhood she had called home for 50 years. I helped her make the arrangements to move to her daughter's home in Guadalajara, a process that was both heartbreaking and necessary. We had become true friends, chosen family who had sustained each other through difficult transitions. Saying goodbye felt like losing a sister, a confidant, a piece of my heart. Before she left, Mrs. Ramirez gave me a small ceramic angel, painted in bright blues and yellows. "For protection," she said, pressing it into my hands. "And to remember that angels come in many forms. You were my angel these past years, Mija. You helped me feel less alone in a country far from home." Her words brought tears I hadn't expected. I had thought I was the one receiving kindness and support from our friendship. But Mrs. Ramirez helped me see that I had been giving something valuable too: companionship, care, and the gift of being truly seen and appreciated by another person. After she left, the quiet in my apartment felt different from the peaceful solitude I had grown to love. This was the ache of missing someone who mattered, the natural sadness that comes from loving someone whose absence creates a real hole in daily life. But even in the sadness, I was grateful for the friendship we had shared and the lessons we had taught each other about dignity, respect, and genuine care. December brought an unexpected letter that would change everything. It was from a lawyer I didn't recognize, informing me that Rebecca was indeed planning to contest my will. But more shocking was the information included in the letter: details about my financial assets that should have been private, evidence that someone had been investigating my estate for months. The betrayal cut deeper than I had thought possible. It was one thing for my children to be disappointed about changes to their inheritances. It was another thing entirely for them to hire investigators to pry into my private financial affairs, to treat my life and death as nothing more than business transactions requiring due diligence. I called Mrs. Coleman immediately, and she confirmed what I had suspected. Rebecca had been working with lawyers for nearly a year, building a case to challenge my will on grounds of mental incompetence. They were planning to argue that my decision to reduce their inheritances and give money to charity proved I was no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. The irony was bitter. For decades, my children had benefited from my financial generosity without ever questioning my mental competence. But now that I was protecting my assets from their exploitation, suddenly my judgment was suspect. They were willing to publicly humiliate me, to claim I was mentally unfit, to destroy what remained of our relationship, all for money they had never earned and didn't deserve. Mrs. Coleman assured me that their case was weak. I had been managing my own affairs competently for years, had undergone recent medical evaluations showing no cognitive decline, and had made reasoned decisions about my estate after careful consideration. But the knowledge that my children were prepared to attack my mental competence to access my money was devastating. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment holding Mrs. Ramirez's ceramic angel, thinking about the complete breakdown of everything I had once held dear. My children weren't just financially exploiting me anymore. They were prepared to destroy my reputation, question my sanity, and turn my death into a legal battleground. But in the darkness of that realization, something shifted. The last vestiges of guilt and obligation that I had been carrying finally dissolved. I was no longer responsible for protecting people who were actively working to harm me. I was no longer obligated to leave my hard-earned assets to people who saw them only as rightful plunder to be claimed by any means necessary. I called Mrs. Coleman the next morning and made an appointment to make final, sweeping changes to my will. If my children wanted to treat my death as a business transaction, I would treat my estate planning the same way. Every decision would be based on logic, fairness, and the greatest good, without sentiment or misplaced loyalty clouding my judgment. The changes I made were dramatic. Rebecca's inheritance was reduced to the legal minimum required to prevent successful contest of the will. Michael and Sarah's portions were similarly cut, though Sarah received slightly more in recognition of her genuine apology and efforts to repair our relationship. The bulk of my estate would go to charities that served vulnerable populations, the food bank, the scholarship fund for single mothers, and organizations that helped elderly people avoid financial exploitation. But the most significant addition was a new provision. If any of my children contested the will, they would forfeit their entire inheritance, which would then be donated to organizations that provide legal services for exploited elderly people. Their choice to challenge my mental competence would trigger consequences that served other families facing similar betrayals. I also rewrote my final letter completely. The new version was unsparing in its assessment of their behavior but also spoke directly to the grandchildren who might someday read it. I wanted future generations to understand not just what had happened, but why boundaries had been necessary and how they might avoid repeating the same destructive patterns. The letter took days to write, balancing honesty with hope, accountability with love. I wrote about the difference between conditional and unconditional love, about the responsibility that comes with receiving generosity, about the importance of treating family relationships as more than financial arrangements. Most importantly, I wrote about the lesson it had taken me 77 years to learn, that you cannot buy love, respect, or genuine family connection with money. Those things must be earned through consistent kindness, mutual support, and the willingness to see other people as more than sources of personal benefit. Christmas that year was the quietest of my adult life. Without Mrs. Ramirez to celebrate with, without family who cared about my presence rather than my presence, I spent the holiday alone in my apartment. But it wasn't the devastating loneliness I might have expected. It was peaceful, contemplative, a time to reflect on the year's changes and prepare for whatever time I had left. I cooked myself a simple but special dinner, opened a bottle of wine Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and toasted the woman I had finally become at 77, someone who valued herself enough to protect her own well-being, someone who understood that real love doesn't require accepting abuse or exploitation. As I sat by my window watching snow fall over Chicago, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. Yes, I was spending Christmas alone. But I was spending it with dignity, self-respect, and the peace that comes from living according to your own values rather than the expectations and demands of others. The new year brought a sense of completion I hadn't anticipated. My legal affairs were in order, my estate plan reflected my true values and wishes, and I had said everything I needed to say in letters that would outlive me. I felt prepared for whatever remained of my life, whether that was months or years. I continued my routines of volunteering, painting, and walking by the lake, but now each activity felt like a gift rather than a distraction from family problems. I was living for the first time in decades, truly living rather than just surviving the demands and disappointments of dysfunctional relationships. Spring arrived early and beautiful, and I planted a garden that was entirely for my own pleasure. No vegetables for ungrateful children, no flowers to brighten someone else's day unless they happened to appreciate them. Just plants I loved, arranged in ways that brought me joy, tended because the process itself was meaningful to me. As I worked in the soil, I thought about growth and seasons, about things that flourish when properly cared for and things that wither despite desperate attention. I thought about the years I had spent trying to force relationships to bloom through constant feeding of money and attention, never understanding that some things simply aren't capable of healthy growth. Now, surrounded by plants that responded to appropriate care with appropriate beauty, I finally understood what healthy relationships looked like. They required mutual effort, reciprocal care, and the ability to appreciate what was offered rather than constantly demanding more. Mother's Day approached again, the third since I had received Rebecca's cruel card and burned it in my kitchen stove. I felt no anxiety about forgotten calls or painful messages, no hope for acknowledgement that wouldn't come. Instead, I felt curiosity about what this day might bring, how I might choose to honor the parts of motherhood that had brought me joy despite the disappointments. I decided to visit the graves of loved ones, including Robert's, to spend time remembering relationships that had been mutually nourishing. I brought flowers from my garden, sat in the quiet of the cemetery, and spoke aloud to people who had known how to love without exploiting, how to receive without taking everything. That afternoon, I wrote letters to mothers I had known who were struggling with similar situations, friends from the food bank whose adult children treated them poorly, neighbors who worried about being used for their resources, women who had sacrificed their own well-being for people who never learned to be grateful. The letters were my attempt to pass along what I had learned, to help other women understand that they didn't have to accept poor treatment from anyone, including their own children. I shared strategies for setting boundaries, resources for emotional support, and most importantly, the hard-won knowledge that you can love someone deeply while still protecting yourself from their harmful behavior. As summer arrived, I felt increasingly aware of time's passage and my own mortality. Not in a morbid way, but with the clarity that comes from understanding life's finite nature. Every sunrise felt like a gift, every peaceful evening like an achievement, every day of living according to my own values like a small victory. I started writing more letters, to people who had mattered to me over the years, to Sophie and my other grandchildren, to friends who might need encouragement to value themselves appropriately. I wanted to leave behind more than just legal documents and financial distributions. I wanted to leave words that might help others avoid the pain I had experienced. The letters to my grandchildren were the most important. I wrote about their grandfather Robert, about family history they might not learn elsewhere, about values and lessons that transcended the current dysfunction. I tried to give them pieces of their heritage that weren't dependent on their parents' willingness to share them. But I also wrote honestly about what had happened between their parents and me, age-appropriately but truthfully. I wanted them to understand that love and money were different things, that family relationships required mutual respect, that they could honor their elders without enabling destructive behavior. Fall brought news that Rebecca's legal challenge to my will was proceeding, despite lawyers' advice that her case was weak. She was apparently willing to spend significant money on legal fees for even a small chance of accessing more of my estate. The irony was perfect. She was spending money she didn't have to fight for, money she hadn't earned, proving exactly why I had decided she couldn't be trusted with larger amounts. I felt no anger about her decision, only sadness that she was so consumed by greed that she would rather fight over my death than work to repair our relationship while I was still alive. But I also felt vindicated in my choice to protect my assets from people who saw them only as entitlements to be claimed rather than gifts to be appreciated. Mrs. Coleman kept me updated on the legal proceedings, but I tried not to let them consume my thoughts or energy. Rebecca's choices were her own responsibility now. I had done everything I could to be clear about my expectations and boundaries. Her decision to ignore those boundaries and pursue legal action only confirmed the wisdom of my estate planning decisions. Winter settled over Chicago again, and I prepared for what I somehow knew would be my last holiday season. My health was still reasonably good, but I felt a subtle shift in energy and awareness that suggested time was growing short. Rather than fear, this knowledge brought a sense of urgency about completing unfinished business and savoring remaining experiences. I spent Christmas Day in quiet reflection, reading letters from friends, looking through photo albums that held 40 years of memories, thinking about the life I had lived and the legacy I was leaving behind. It was a peaceful day, unmarked by family drama or financial stress, filled with gratitude for lessons learned even when they came at great personal cost. As the new year arrived, I felt ready for whatever was coming next. My affairs were in order, my relationships were honest and authentic, and I had finally learned to value myself appropriately. Whether I lived another month or another decade, I would spend that time as the woman I had finally become, someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than respectable treatment from anyone. Looking back over the journey from that cruel Mother's Day card to this place of hard-won peace, I could see the thread that connected every painful decision, every difficult boundary, every moment of choosing self-respect over convenience. I had learned that love without respect was just exploitation wearing a prettier name, that generosity without appreciation was just enabling disguised as virtue. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to change course, to demand better treatment, to live according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. At 77, I had finally discovered what it meant to truly love myself enough to protect myself from people who couldn't love me properly in return. The cruel words, "thanks for nothing," had been intended to wound, but they had actually awakened something in me that had been sleeping for decades, the knowledge that I deserved better. In trying to hurt me, my daughter had accidentally set me free. The fire that consumed her cruel card had also burned away the chains of obligation and guilt that had bound me to relationships that brought only pain. Now, as I sit in my peaceful apartment watching another Chicago sunset paint my windows gold, I understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic kindness and respect. Sometimes saying no to exploitation is the same as saying yes to your own worth. I think about Robert often, wondering if he would be proud of the woman I finally became. I believe he would approve of my decision to stop enabling our children's selfishness, to protect the assets we worked so hard to accumulate from people who saw them only as easy money. He always said that real love sometimes requires difficult choices, and he would understand why those choices became necessary. My grandchildren may someday read the letters I've left them and understand why their grandmother chose dignity over peace, boundaries over convenience, self-respect over family harmony. They may learn from my example that you can love someone deeply while still refusing to be used by them, that healthy relationships require effort from all parties, not just endless giving from one side. The scholarship fund I've established will help other women become independent and self-sufficient, breaking cycles of financial dependence that trap so many people in unhealthy relationships. The money my children thought they were entitled to will instead serve people who are working to better their lives rather than expecting others to solve their problems. And perhaps most importantly, the legal consequences I've established for contesting my will serve as a final lesson. Actions have consequences, even when you think you're entitled to whatever you want. The children who spent decades treating me like an ATM will discover that some withdrawals come with penalties they never anticipated. As I finish writing this account of my transformation, I feel profound gratitude for the journey that brought me to this place of peace. The pain was terrible, the loneliness was crushing at times, the fear of losing family relationships was overwhelming. But all of that suffering led to something invaluable, the discovery of my own worth and the strength to protect it. I learned that you cannot love people into loving you properly. You cannot buy respect or genuine affection. You cannot enable someone into becoming a better person. But you can choose to love yourself enough to step away from relationships that drain your soul and diminish your spirit. The woman who once measured her worth by how much she could give to ungrateful recipients became a woman who understood that her value was inherent, not earned through service or sacrifice. The mother who enabled destructive behavior in the name of love became a person who understood that real love sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it came at a cost I never imagined I would be willing to pay. But it was worth every tear, every lonely night, every moment of doubt and fear. Because at the end of this journey, I found something I had lost somewhere along the way, myself. To anyone listening who recognizes pieces of your own story in mine, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand respect, to set boundaries, to stop accepting poor treatment from people who should cherish you. The fear of loneliness is real, but the peace of living authentically is worth facing that fear. Love should not require you to diminish yourself, exhaust your resources, or accept abuse in any form. Real love honors your boundaries, appreciates your sacrifices, and gives back as much as it receives. If the people in your life cannot offer that kind of love, you deserve to find people who can. The cruel Mother's Day card that shattered my heart also opened a door I never knew existed, the door to a life lived on my own terms, according to my own values, in relationships that honor rather than exploit my capacity for love. Walking through that door was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the most important. Now, as sunset fades to twilight over the city I've called home for so many years, I raise a glass of wine to the woman I finally became and to everyone who finds the courage to value themselves enough to demand better. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the refusal to accept less than you deserve. Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life, or known someone who has struggled with family members who took their love and generosity for granted? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find the strength to make difficult but necessary changes in their own relationships. And if this story touched your heart or helped you see your own situation more clearly, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these difficult truths helps them reach others who need to hear that they're not alone, that their feelings are valid, and that choosing self-respect over convenience is not selfish, it's necessary. Thank you for listening to my story, for allowing me to share the most painful and ultimately liberating experience of my life. May you find the courage to love yourself enough to demand the respect and appreciation you deserve.